Welcome to Professor Burkett's lesson on verbal voice, a lesson in the forms and functions of active and passive voice, and the principles for when to choose each in the interest of writing with clarity and style. This is a lesson in the art of grammar, or techne grammaticae. Well, problematic passive voice. What is the passive voice, and why are people saying such bad things about it? Well, a common problem with some writers is overusing the passive voice. Passive voice can be a problem because it is simply indirect. It's wordy. It reverses normal English syntax that prefers the subject-verb-object flow. It's sometimes morally evasive, maybe oftentimes evasive of responsibility. It's not as engaging, muscular, or personable as active voice because it suppresses the writer's voice. What is verbal voice anyway? Voice is a quality of transitive verbs, verbs that take direct objects, and refers to how speakers and writers express action in sentences. Well, there's the active voice. The subject can perform the action, thus indicating the writer's voice. Or the passive voice. The subject can be acted upon, thus omitting or suppressing the writer's voice. But English has no middle or reflexive voice like many languages. English expresses the middle or reflexive voice by means of adding some pronouns like myself or himself or oneself. Well, let's look at the form and function of active and passive voice. The active voice in form has A does B, whereas the passive voice in form has B is done, and the writer could add the agent by A if he or she wants to. Well, in function, for active voice, the subject performs the action, but the function in passive voice, the subject receives the action or is acted upon. Example, Father, I chopped down the cherry tree, said our first President George Washington, in a heroic statement of accepting responsibility, a heroic statement of virtue. But what if President George Washington used the passive voice and said, Father, the cherry tree was chopped down? Would he be the icon of virtue that we hold him to be? Absolutely not. He'd be avoiding the responsibility and suppressing his voice and agency by using the passive voice. Well, the form of passive voice. Let's take a look at the exact pattern or form that passive voice takes so we can recognize it. Well, passive voice includes the linking verb plus a past participle of the verb, and that equals passive voice. The linking verb in English is usually be, and this is sometimes called the copula. It can also be synonyms of the be verb. So, be plus past participle equals passive voice. Example, the football was thrown by someone. So that's the passive voice. Or, according to the Exxon company, a few gallons might have been spilled. Now, why might the Exxon company have been using the passive voice here? Well, again, the passive voice consists of the to be verb, or a synonym of such, plus the past participle. Several verbs can function as linking verbs, including get, become, seem, appear, look, prove, believe, remain, feel, smell, taste, sound, turn, and grow, depending on the situation. For example, the slang I got bit, and many of my southern friends use that expression, and I'm still their friend. Or one could say I was bitten, okay, possibly by a mosquito. And these are instances of passive voice, both with got and with the to be verb was. A note of qualification. Not all sentences formed with is plus a past participle function or feel like passive voice. For instance, which sentence is passive voice out of these two? The team was beaten. The team was excited. Well, in each case, the past participle is used as an adjective, but the first one is passive voice and feels that way. And in the second example, excited functions more as an adjective. Let's look at normal syntax and how passive voice reverses the syntax. In active voice, you might have a sentence such as, I did the deed, where you have subject, verb, object, and you have an agent that acts and accomplishes a goal, or the object. In passive voice, this is completely reversed, where you have the deed was done by an agent, if I wish to include an optional prepositional phrase to reveal the agent. And so you can see in this chart how passive voice reverses the normal subject-verb-object syntax that English prefers. And I might add that readers prefer. Well, my synonym for passive voice is missing persons. So how does passive voice sap the life out of sentences? Well, first, linking verbs express a state of being, not action. So no voice exists with passive voice, with these linking verbs. Second, linking verbs do not require active, responsible agents as subjects. And third, passive voice removes action and suppresses or hides persons or agents within sentences. And so missing persons is an apt paraphrase of the result of passive. Well, passive voice is also evasive voice. For different reasons, people often use passive voice for moral or polite evasion. Politicians, because it's evasive. Managers, because it's evasive. Scientists, because it seems objective, but it's not really objective, it just seems that way. Bureaucrats, because it's passive-aggressive. Bitter people, because it's passive-aggressive. And insincere sorry-sayers, because it shifts blame. And we'll look at some live examples from each of these 6 categories. The scandal of the Watergate scandal was largely accomplished via passive voice. And this was the case because nobody wanted to reveal that they were involved. So everybody spoke with the passive voice. So here we have a conversation between Chinese Vice Premier Ding and Henry Kissinger, who's the Secretary of State. Ding says, "Why is there such a big noise being made about Watergate?" Well, Kissinger, that is a series of almost incomprehensible events. It has its roots in the fact that some mistakes were made, but also when you change many policies, you make many, many enemies. So here you see that Kissinger is using the phrase mistakes were made. Nobody reveals who made these mistakes because the person and the agent is missing. And so here we have an example of passive voice as evasive voice. Well, passive voice was also common in the communications about the Iran-Contra scandal. President Reagan states, "While we are still seeking all the facts, it's obvious that the execution of these policies was flawed and mistakes were made. Let me just say that it was not my intent to do business with Khomeini, to trade weapons for hostages in Iran, nor to undercut our policy of anti-terrorism." So here we find that policies were flawed and mistakes were made. We don't know who caused the flaw or who made the mistakes because that information is hidden behind the passive voice. Well, likewise, across the aisle, not only Republicans but also Democrats use passive voice. And in this case, we have President Clinton is hiding or evading the issue of campaign finances via passive voice. So Clinton states, "It cost so much money to pay for these campaigns that mistakes were made here by people who either did it deliberately or inadvertently. Now, others, it's up to others to decide whether those mistakes were made deliberately or inadvertently." And so here we have the phrase mistakes were made, repeated a number of times, and so it becomes part of the political and even the journalist vocabulary when it comes to evading responsibility. Another example, CEO Jamie Dimon of J.P. Morgan Chase Bank writes, "We know mistakes were made about the controversial bonuses that he paid to company executives after receiving the money from taxpayer-funded support via the Troubled Asset Relief Program occurring in 2009. So we have mistakes were made as a use of passive voice regarding financial evasion. Another example, the IRS evasion is accomplished through passive voice. So the Internal Revenue Service writes, mistakes were made initially, but they were in no way due to any political or partisan rationale. In a statement apologizing for improperly auditing, or harassing conservative groups during the 2012 presidential election. So here we have this phrase again, mistakes were made, but we don't know who made these mistakes or who is doing the harassing. So somebody is hiding behind these passive voice. And even if you're going to be a cartoonist, you have to know about these phrases and use of passive voice. Mistakes were made. So if one's going to be a journalist or a cartoonist, one needs to be aware of the uses and misuses of passive voice. Well, managers use passive voice to evade responsibility. And here's an actual manager's message addressed to a work team at a hospital. And this happens to be a message to my wife's work team. And she showed it to me. And I thought, wow, this is a perfect example of the misuse of passive voice. And the manager probably doesn't even know that she is using passive voice. So, all facilities have been asked to do an end of fiscal year push. Overtime has been mandated until the week of July 4th. Of course, if all the coding is caught up, overtime will not be needed. This will be decided on a week-to-week basis. So you can see all the verbs are transformed into passive voice. So the final paragraph, please let me know if further information is needed or if clarification is needed. Thanks. Well, managers are paid to take responsibility, but this manager, like many managers, hides behind passive voice. That is, actions just happen. This manager did not take the responsibility to be the agent of these actions. So I think this letter would be much better, and it would show the manager's responsibility if she wrote in the active voice. That's what managers are paid to do. They're paid and relied upon to make important decisions on behalf of the company. Well, why is legal writing often in passive voice? Why do lawyers always draft amendments, measures, and referenda on voters' ballots using the passive voice? So here are two recent examples. Shall the order that was adopted on August 6, 2012, authorizing community college bonds, and then 18 lines later we find the verb in passive voice, be approved. I would prefer that the legal writers reverse the syntax and put the verb up front. And how about another example? Vote no on Amendment 3 to have it added to the state constitution. Well, here, why are we voting no to have something added? And why have the passive or past participle as the verb here? Again, I think there's a lot of evasion behind the passive voice. Well, one often finds science writing and science reports conducted in passive voice. Here's an example from a textbook, The Essentials of Biology, which is a standard high school biology textbook. More and more hominid fossils have been found and their ages determined. The fossils are like parts of a puzzle. Many parts are still missing. As the missing parts are filled in, we can better understand the stages of human evolution. Well, I want to know who is finding, determining, and interpreting uh, information about these fossils. We don't know. It just happens. But behind the passive voice are actual persons finding, determining, filling in, and interpreting the facts. But the passive voice makes science writing look more objective, but we know it's not. It's not more objective. And so they've erased the persons from this kind of writing. There's no active, responsible agent who are actually performing the verbs, according to the writing. And we find that students, they might know nothing about passive voice, but they still replicate it in their writing. So here's a student lab report. It was decided to do the transpiration experiment. The experiment was done by my lab group and was repeated 3 times. The results were obtained. These results will be discussed. Well, why are the students using passive voice throughout? Well, I think it would be helpful if the writers just included an active agent, a character in the writing, such as my lab group or just my group. And so you can see how science writing is steeped with the passive voice. But a science writer on passive voice says, stop it, no more. It's not helpful to use the passive voice. So Linda Cooper, a science writer, writes the following. Scientists tend to think that the passive voice creates an objective tone, but that when they rely too heavily on passive constructions, researchers rarely capture the enthusiasm they have for their work. Although such writing may be fine for bureaucrats, moving or removing the scientist from an article drains life from the paper. And that's true. It saps the life out of writing. And it may create an objective tone, but careful readers recognize that the objectivity is just an illusion. There is actual subjects behind all the instances of the passive tone. Well, another example, there's bureaucratic evasion is usually accomplished via passive voice. In bureaucracies, there's such a hierarchy that nobody really knows who is making decisions, and nobody feels comfortable making decisions. And so people pass on or hide responsibility by use of the passive voice. For instance, if your vehicle has been booted or towed because it was illegally parked, redeem your vehicle directly from the New York City Police Department. Or again, the State Department of Health has been notified about all the wastewater spills. Sounds like a disaster. Warning signs are being posted and water samples are being collected. The public is advised to avoid the affected waters. And so bureaucracies typically communicate in passive voice because they're evading some type of responsibility. They don't want to take responsibility, and that's too bad. Well, passive aggression is often accomplished by means of passive voice, and it is hilariously hostile but painfully polite kinds of communication. For example, in the picture of the sign that's posted here. The misuse of these bins will now be monitored and reported to management. But the question is, who just is monitoring and reporting others' private activities in the restroom? One wonders. And then there's the insincere sorry-sayers who transfer blame by means of passive voice. So here's a quotation from Justin Timberlake and Janet Jackson. I am sorry that anyone was offended by the wardrobe malfunction during the halftime performance of the Super Bowl. Well, this actually transfers blame because they only apologize if anyone was offended. So pardon me for having morals or standards that are capable of offense. So another example from Arnold Schwarzenegger. If anyone was offended, I apologize because that was not my intention. Well, I suppose if I was not offended, he would not apologize. So I feel guilty and bad for having standards that are that anyone can offend. And then another example, Mel Gibson. To anyone who was offended by my comments, such as his anti-Semitic comments, I am sorry. But I guess it's possible if you were not offended, he would not apologize. And so it actually places the blame on the audience member, on me, for having some type of moral standards that these people can offend. And if no one was offended, they would not apologize. Well, how people make their confessions says a lot about their character. Are celebrities capable of apologizing? Well, journalists and the public are listening, reading, and watching for whether public figures are even capable of apologizing, or whether they evade responsibility, often by means of the passive voice. Who else should listen attentively to language? Well, I think those working in the counseling field or in psychology, those working in sales, those involved in relationships, whether it's with friends or with a marriage partner, should pay attention to verbal voice and how people use or misuse the passive voice to evade responsibility. Well, in his famous essay, The Politics in the English Language from 1946, George Orwell, the famous British author, identifies passive voice as one of the swindles and perversions of language because it tends to hide blame and obscure responsibility. So, by recognizing when and how people communicate in the active or passive voice, one will become a more sensitive and critical reader. Well, how to create active voice? Well, in order to avoid passive voice, one has to create active voice. And you might follow these steps. Name your characters. For each paragraph, you might chart out the personal and virtual agents one might use as the agent in the subject position of the sentences. Write down or list your characters as you draft your writing. Make those characters the grammatical subjects, that is, the responsible agents of most of your sentences. And there are some big benefits. Readers will recognize the agent who is responsible for verbal action in sentences. They want to know who does what. And writers will create a consistent perspective and paragraphs that feel coherent and cohesive. When should one use the passive voice? Well, use active voice with strong verbs is a writer's principle, but it's not an absolute rule. Writers may prefer passive voice to emphasize or de-emphasize parts of a sentence, or to reverse the sentence's syntax to create the old-new flow. Writers try hard not to overuse or misuse the passive voice. After all, the passive voice is a grammatical construction that's correct in any language, but it can be overused. So passive voice is grammatically correct, but it's often bad style. Well, what do the handbooks advise? You may recall advice to avoid passive verbs. Good advice when a passive verb forces you to write a sentence that contradicts the principles we have discussed. Well, writers work to balance several stylistic principles, including those that are outlined in Turabian's A Manual for Writers, Chapter 11. Well, the active voice is supported by most stylistic principles, or to change that to active voice, I might say most stylistic principles support the active voice, including 3 or 4 main principles of clear style. And these follow here. Make subjects short and concrete, preferably characters. Avoid interrupting subjects and verbs with more than a word or two. And that is, keep the subject-verb-object flow without many interruptions. Put key actions in verbs, not nouns. And put information familiar to readers at the beginning of a sentence, new information at the end. Well, only the last principle of style might require passive voice. The first three principles of good style all require active voice. Well, when may passive voice help? Well, passive voice may help when writers wish to de-emphasize the actor because the actor is obvious, unimportant, or unknown or mysterious. Examples: English is spoken here. The actor is obvious. It's whoever works inside the establishment. I was saved last year. Well, the actor is obvious. It was the Holy Spirit or Jesus. And so passive voice retains the mystery of God's action on the earth. My car has been stolen. Well, the actor is unknown, and probably the writer of the sentence doesn't care. He's just concerned, or she's just concerned, that the car has been stolen. Next, have the writers been announced, or have the winners been announced? Well, here the actor is unimportant. What's important is the announcement of the winners. Or another example, Peter describes his vision. There is something like a large sheet coming down from heaven, being lowered by its four corners. And here the passive voice is used because the agent, the person who is lowering something from heaven, is mysterious, and it protects probably the secret agency of the Holy Spirit, God working on earth. Well, passive voice may help when writers want to reverse normal syntax to emphasize a sentence's focus or flow. For instance, Sarah was raised in Hawaii. The passive voice puts the focus on Sarah, not her parents. How about the next example? The hurricane has delayed this week's games, but today's game will be played even if it rains. And so here the flow from the first clause to the second clause is retained by means of the passive voice, which puts the emphasis on games. So the passive voice helps create flow, emphasis, and parallelism. Well, passive voice may help when writers want to reverse normal syntax to create parallelism and emphasis. Example from Jesus' famous Sermon on the Mount. Ask, and it shall be given to you. Seek, and ye shall find. Knock, and it shall be opened to you. So here the passive voice helps create the parallelism and the secret agency of God operating in people's lives. Well, the passive voice may help when writers want to sound polite by de-emphasizing their responsibility or to diminish the sound of bad news. Overtime has been mandated, states the manager. But active voice can be just as polite and show responsibility. For instance, management is mandating or requiring overtime. I think creating an active agent like management or the management team is emphasizes the management's responsibility and is a little more honest and forthcoming with those who receive the management's letter, namely the employees. I know as an employee, I always appreciate it when the management or the administration uses the active voice self-consciously. Well, passive voice may help when writers are working in a scientific genre or context that traditionally and persistently uses passive voice, such as science writing. Example, the sodium hydroxide was dissolved in water, and so forth. But why not create a subject? How about the lab group or the group dissolved the sodium hydroxide in water and then titrated it? So I have worked with writers and have counseled them on, I've worked with science writers and counseled them on creating an appropriate agent that they can write and put in the subject position of many of their sentences. We'll become aware of voice, verbal voice, active and passive voice. Passive voice should be recognized by readers and writers. Oh, there is a social faux pas of passive voice. Let me improve upon that. Readers should recognize passive voice by its forms and functions, what it's doing, not doing, and hiding. Readers and writers prefer active voice for its clarity, that is trust, liveliness, that is energy, and is honesty. 4. What is at stake are the ethical expectations of a civil society. Well, I want to thank you at the end of this lesson for your attention. You probably know more about active and passive voice than you ever wanted to know, and of its importance in our society. Well, I wish you the best as you take your grammar quiz, and also encourage you to avoid passive voice and prefer active voice when writing your next essay and assignment. So I look forward to seeing you in class.